This is a starting point for my home theater. It's a living room. It's 17 feet long by 13 feet wide. I'll be locating my primary seating area 68% back from the front wall. So let's start with speaker placement. For my 3 front speakers, I'm going to try and move them away from my front wall and away from my side wall as much as I can. And I'm going to draw an equilateral triangle from the left speaker to the center of the listening position to the right speaker and back to the left. And so I want those 3 lines to be exactly the same. I'll start with placing my speakers at those 2 points. And then later on, as I tune the room, I can move those speakers side to side and tow them in or out to get the sound that I want. Now I have a 7-channel system, so I have these side channels and these rear channels to place. So where I'm going to place them is off this cross axis here through the center of the listening position. I'll place my side speakers 30 degrees off of that axis, and then my rear speakers 30 degrees to the rear. And just like my front speakers, I'll be pulling them away from the wall as much as I can. Now in my room, I'll have 2 subwoofers, and so I'm going to have my one subwoofer back here behind the couch and another one off to the side. Now let's move on to acoustic treatment. These are the things that I think in order are the first to the most important, not the least important, but they're all important. First thing to deal with is bass management. Bass waves are huge and they're powerful, and they will linger in a room longer than any other types of waves. And so if you don't tackle the bass, you're going to have a lot of bass bouncing around in a relatively small room. If you have a huge room, it's not as much of a problem, but most living rooms like mine that are 17 feet by 13 feet are not huge, and they have an 8-foot ceiling. So I think a 50 hertz wave is probably about 20 feet. So that is bigger than the room, and it's just going to bang around in that room and stick around. So you have to treat that bass, try to manage it, try to slow it down or stop it as much as you can. Second one is the first reflection management. That would be coming off the front 3 speakers. I'm absorbing them, but I think you could diffuse them also, but I'm going to start with absorption and see how that works. Next one is the rear wall treatment. That wall is, the front speakers are just hitting that wall and the sound is bouncing back at you. That is maybe as important as the first reflection. So you really want to treat that appropriately. I'm going to have a mix of absorption and diffusion in the back wall, because I do like bigger sound, so diffusion will give you more of an airy, bigger sound than absorption will. And then you've got other areas in the room, like I've got a spot that's up above my head that I like to put some diffusion in to give me more of an airy feeling above there too. Before getting into room treatment, it's good to talk about waves in general. First of all, wavelengths. And sound waves travel at 1125 feet per second. And so to figure out a wavelength, you basically need to know the number of cycles per second, or the hertz of that sound wave. And let's take, for example, a 50 hertz sound wave, and that's the sound of, or the frequency of a kick drum. It's a fairly low sound. And so if you take that 50 and divide it evenly through 1125 feet, inside of 1 second, you'll get a wavelength that's 22.5 feet long. So that's a fairly long wavelength, and it's fairly powerful. So you can imagine inside of a 17-foot room with an 8-foot ceiling, these concussions of wavelengths that are 22 feet long are going to bang around inside of the room, and they're not going to go away very quickly. So you have to consider different types of room treatment that will handle that kind of a wavelength. A piece of foam probably won't do very well against something that big and powerful. It'll help a little bit, but there's other ways to treat that kind of wavelength. Now looking at a high frequency wavelength, like a 10,000 hertz wavelength, that is a small wave. It's about a tenth of an inch long, a tenth of a foot long, so it's maybe 1.5 inches. And that tiny wave is going to be handled by a piece of acoustic foam, no problem, or acoustic insulation, let's say. So you have different frequencies, different powers of frequencies, different intensities, and you need to handle those different ways, and just imagine the size of these things bouncing around the room. That helps you understand what's going on inside of your room. The next video is a good way of thinking of sound waves in a small room. This is me driving a boat through the Montlake Cut in Seattle. This is a fairly narrow channel. Now the boats going through are not big boats, so the wakes aren't very big, but you can see the result is very choppy water. The water is basically bouncing back and forth off the parallel walls and creating kind of a mess. And so you're trying to splash through this stuff, understanding that these wakes are just going to bounce back and forth until they dissipate on their own. And this is a little bit like sound waves inside of a small room, especially with parallel walls. You're going to get these sound waves that are just ringing back and forth, and it's good to somehow treat them and consider those large parallel walls, and also consider the large waves. So if you had a big boat go through pretty quickly, you'd make a wake that's as big as this channel, and so you can imagine what would happen. The wave would overwhelm the channel, would splash off over the sides, and it would just be going back and forth for a long period of time. So the next video is me just driving out into open water, and you can see that the water is calmer, and basically the wakes coming off of the boats, they just go off to the sides, they dissipate out. Now you would think, okay, the best thing to do in my room is just absorb everything. Well, that's not, for sound, that's really not the best, because it'll make it sound too dead.